so it will be available for viewing in the future. Now, a little bit about our presenter. Dr. Emma Dutton is an instructional designer for ANAB. She has provided instructions on a variety of conformity assessment topics to the forensics community since 2013. Prior to joining ANAB, Emma spent more than 11 years as a quality assurance manager in a forensic laboratory. Her portfolio includes 12 years performing research and development in pharmaceuticals and biotechnology industries, as well as teaching biology as an adjunct professor at several universities. Before we get started, I do want to provide you with some logistics. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your question into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer questions asked. And again, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for you to view in the future. Now, without undue delay, I am passing control to Dr. Emma Dutton, who will take you further through the webinar.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. This is Emma, and welcome to the ANAB webinar on how to validate or to verify. And really, that is the question. Just a few key takeaways for you today. Really, we're trying to present to you the 17025 and the 17020 requirements for validation and verification, so you can walk away with an understanding of the difference between the two and when each is required. And then giving you some information so you know when you should do a validation versus a verification, and hopefully give you some knowledge on how to set up or develop your verification and validation plan. So why do we do verification or validation? Really, we do it so we understand the method and we understand how the method or the procedure provides an accurate, reliable result for us. It's for us to understand those performance characteristics of that method or that procedure to give us that assurance that our analytical methods are reliable, that they produce accurate and valid results, that the method is fit for purpose or its intended use, and that the method actually meets the needs of that end user. It really helps us provide that empirical data that tells us that the method meets our predetermined specifications, our requirements, that that method is capable of successfully performing at the level that it's intended to be used, and that it describes those performance characteristics that we need it to have, where we're specifying those underlying conditions that it must meet. It really helps us to identify the limitations of the method under normal operating conditions in our laboratory, and it helps us to define the scope and range of conditions under which we can provide accurate and reliable results. So what is the difference between verification and validation? 17025 helps us out because 17025 actually gives us the definition of verification and validation. For verification, it's a provision of objective evidence that a given item fulfills specified requirements. Here, those specified requirements are the performance characteristics, and they've already been established. So what we do is we verify that those performance characteristics can be met within our laboratory under our laboratory conditions. A validation, on the other hand, is where the specified requirements are adequate for an intended use. And validation, the definition starts with that it's a verification or a type of verification. Really, for a validation, what you're determining and establishing are those performance characteristics under which that method operates. So keep in mind that not every verification is a validation, but every validation is a type of verification. In one instance, for verification, you're determining that those performance characteristics that have already been established meet your needs in your laboratory. Validation, on the other hand, you're actually establishing those performance characteristics. So verification is required in several places in 17025. So let's start with 6.4.4. It says that the lab shall verify that equipment conforms to specified requirements before being placed or returned into service. So in this case, you already have specified requirements that are in your methods. You get that piece of equipment and you determine that that equipment works according to those specified requirements. 645 goes on to say that the equipment used for measurement shall be capable of achieving the measurement accuracy and or measurement uncertainty required to provide a valid result. Measurement accuracy and measurement uncertainty are two of those performance characteristics that you'll need to verify in your laboratory that you can meet with that piece of equipment that you use or that you purchase. And we have to think about those specified requirements. 644 says you have to have those specified requirements, and these are typically written in your own methods or your own procedures. And some of those specified requirements include that measurement accuracy and measurement uncertainty. 17025 also has a requirement in 7.2.1.5 that indicates that the lab shall verify that it can properly perform, quote, standard methods before introducing them by ensuring that it can achieve the required performance. And I say, quote, standard methods because standard method is a method that has already been validated and published, and you're then verifying the established performance characteristics and that you can meet those performance characteristics in your laboratory with your people, with your reagents, with your laboratory environmental conditions. Keep in mind that when you do that verification, it says records of the verification shall be retained. And of course, if the method is revised by the issuing body, then verification shall be repeated to the extent necessary. So again, for this verification of methods, the performance characteristics or parameters have already been established. You're just determining that you can meet those performance characteristics within your laboratory. 17020 is quite silent on verification versus validation, but it does say in 7.1.1 that the inspection body shall use the methods and procedures for inspection which are defined in the requirements against which inspection is to be performed. Where these are not defined, the inspection body shall develop specific methods and procedures. And those two things right there speak to whether or not you're going to be using standard methods versus non-standard methods. If you're developing specific methods and procedures, it says C 7.1.3, and 7.1.3 indicates when the inspection body has to use inspection methods or procedures which are non-standard, such as methods and procedures shall be appropriate and fully documented. And then in the note, it gives some examples on what is a standard method versus a non-standard method. Again, typically standard methods are those methods that have already been validated and they've been published, either through some peer-reviewed journal publication or published and posted to a national standard, international standard, or regional standard. The note says a standard inspection method is one that has been published, for example, in the international, regional, or national standards, or by reputable technical organizations, or by cooperation of several inspection bodies, or in relevant scientific texts or journals. Those are all of our standard methods. Non-standard methods are developed by either the laboratory, the inspection body, the client, and again, they're considered non-standard. Typically, non-standard methods must be validated. Standard methods need to be verified. So examples of when to perform a verification is when you have a new piece of equipment that you purchase and it's replacing a piece of equipment where you've already established the method for the use on that piece of equipment. You then verify that that piece of equipment meets your specified requirements. When you're using equipment that is outside your laboratory's permanent control, you need to make sure that that piece of equipment, again, meets your specified requirements. So verify that it's working according to your specified requirements. Also, don't forget about when you take a piece of equipment out of service, before you place it back into service, you need to verify that it, again, is meeting your specified requirements. So after equipment maintenance, when used by another agency, or if you're using another agency's piece of equipment, verify that it's working. Also perform a verification when you intend to adopt a new standard method into your laboratory. So in this case, if there's a standard method out there, a published validated method that's been established where the performance characteristics are defined, you want to bring that into your laboratory and use it, or the inspection body wants to use it, then you need to verify that is working in your laboratory with your people, with your reagents, with your equipment, according to the established performance characteristics to meet your needs and your specified requirements. So when is validation required? Now that we understand when we have to verify, we have to also think about when we must validate. And this comes up in 17025 7.2.2.1, where it talks about validation of methods. It says the lab shall validate non-standard methods, laboratory developed methods, and standard methods used outside their intended scope or otherwise modified. And the validation shall be as extensive as is necessary to meet the needs of the given application or field of application. So if you're bringing in a method that is a non-standard method, maybe it's developed by another laboratory, it hasn't been published or peer reviewed, it's not adopted as a standard method, maybe you're developing your own method to use for your own purposes, or you're taking in a standard method that has been modified for your use. All of those need to be validated. But keep in mind that validation is needed to be as extensive as necessary for you to have assurance that it's meeting your specified requirements. So validation can include procedures for sampling, for handling, and transportation of tests or calibration items. In addition, it says when changes are made to a validated method, the influence of such changes shall be determined, and where they are found to affect the original validation, a new method validation shall be performed. And lastly, the laboratory information management system used for the collection, processing, recording, reporting, storage, or retrieval of data shall be validated. And here is where you're validating for functionality. It says wherever or whenever there are any changes to that LIMS system, they shall be authorized, documented, and validated before implementation. And 17020 has a similar requirement when it's talking about computers and LIMS systems. It says if the inspection body uses computers or automated equipment in connection with inspections, it shall ensure that a computer software is adequate for use. And then in the note, it talks about how that can be done. How can you determine that that computer software is adequate? You can validate the calculations before you use them. You can have periodic revalidation of the related hardware and software, or you can revalidate whenever there are changes that are made to the hardware or software. So this is the one place where it talks about validation in 17020 regarding computers or automated equipment. So in summary, the difference between verification versus validation. Verification, the performance characteristics have already been established. Those come in to play when we're talking about standard methods. And there's that note back in 17020 that talks about what a standard method is. A standard method is a method that has been established and published by an international, regional, or national standard, such as ANSI is our National Standards Institute, and there are many standard methods that have been published there. A standard method could be one that is published and peer-reviewed in a scientific text or journal. That could be considered a standard method. But for any standard method, it's a method where all the performance characteristics have been already validated and published as those performance characteristics for that method. You then verify those performance characteristics are fit for the intended application or use. You verify that the lab can perform that method and that it meets your needs, your specifications, and the customer's requirements as well. You also verify equipment, and this is where you've already established a method for that piece of equipment, and maybe you purchase a new piece of equipment to replace an old piece of equipment. So you verify the performance of that piece of equipment to see that it's already meeting or that it meets your laboratory's specifications. You can also see if it's meeting the manufacturer's specifications for that piece of equipment. You verify equipment when you're using equipment that's outside your permanent control to make sure it's working according to your specifications. And then you verify that piece of equipment after maintenance when it's been taken out of service and before you place it back into service. For validation, on the other hand, you're establishing and determining those performance characteristics. You do this for non-standard methods, methods that you develop for a specific purpose, or for standard methods that are used outside their intended scope or modified. If you have a change to a validated method, you need to see how that affects the validation and then possibly revalidate. And of course, if you're bringing on new equipment, new technology that's novel to the laboratory, and you have not determined the performance characteristics, and you've never used that methodology for operating that piece of equipment, then you need to validate that as well. So it's typically a validation of the piece of equipment in conjunction with the method that you're validating for how to perform and operate that piece of equipment. And of course, for any type of laboratory information management system, validate for functionality and adequacy. So now that we know the difference between a verification versus a validation, how do you even begin to start this verification or validation? And the approaches to verification and validation are similar. So as such, from here forward, I'm going to use the word validation, but really I'm going to be referring to both verification and validation. And what I have found to be most effective when I think about doing a verification or a validation is to have a plan. So start with a verification or validation plan. Really, it's a document that describes how and when the validation will be conducted. It outlines the purpose, the scope of that validation. It gives details about the materials and methods to be used for the validation. It outlines your performance characteristics that you're going to verify or establish. And it takes into consideration any statistical techniques that are going to be used and how you're going to go about collecting the data, processing the data, analyzing the data, and evaluating that data, and even reporting on that information. But keep in mind that the plan needs to be as extensive as is necessary to meet the needs of the given application, whether it be for a verification or a validation. So some plans might be very simple in nature. That is, you're going to verify the established performance characteristics. Some are going to be a little more extensive, especially when you're doing laboratory developed methods. ANSI 17025 gives us some information in Note 2 in 7.2.2.1 that talks about some of the techniques that you can use and consider when you're putting together your validation plan. And they give a list of these various techniques that you can use. Talks about using calibration or evaluation of bias and precision using reference standards or reference materials. Talks about using systematic assessment of the factors that influence the results. Some of those assessment of those factors could be environmental, like temperature or humidity or vibration, or other factors within the environment that could influence the results. Talks about method robustness through the variation of controlled parameters. Comparison of results achieved with other validated methods, so comparing the method that you're trying to validate with previously validated methods. Doing those interlaboratory comparisons and taking that information to assist with the validation of your method or verification of your method. And then the evaluation of measurement uncertainty for some types of data is essential, where you have to evaluate that measurement uncertainty for that quantitative measurement result. So let's look at the components of a validation plan. And this is my compilation of a validation plan. If you look out there and Google it, and you can find everything you want, if you Google it, you might see that there are 6 components to validation plan, and some have 2 components to validation plan. But I tried to outline it here and have 4 basic components. And from experience, I can tell you that the methodology section is probably going to be the bulk of your time in getting that methodology outlined to the point to where you can move forward with doing the experiments. But one of the first things that you need to do is with that introduction. You need to think about, what is the title? Give your verification validation a title and really outline the purpose of that verification or validation and the scope of that verification and validation. This really sets the stage for that validation. It gets everyone on the same page, and it really outlines your goals and what you want to accomplish with that verification or validation. Consider the timeline and how long it's going to take you to get through this verification and validation, and of course those participants that are going to be a part of that and their responsibilities. Keeping in mind, there is a new requirement in 17025 that says if you do validation, if you do verification, if you establish new methods, develop methods, you need to be authorized to do that. So don't forget about those authorizations for those individuals that are going to be participating in that validation. You need to do a literature review and think about the terms and definitions that you're going to be using to make sure, again, everyone is on the same page. And then don't forget about that risk analysis. What are the risks associated with that verification or validation? Just an example here on a purpose or scope statement. It really does describe the reason, your intention, your objectives, what you want to accomplish for doing that validation or verification, and really the requirements that are needed to complete the project. Including what is your desired outcome? What do you want to accomplish in the end? So it may include, but not be limited to, the following: that title, talking about the type of validation, whether it be for a method or an instrument verification, a method development, standard method, modification, non-standard method, whether it be quantitative, qualitative, presumptive test, a screening test for an instrument. And then, of course, the samples to be used and the purpose for which the results will be used. So what are the types of samples that you're going to use? Known reference standards, known reference materials, where are you going to collect the samples, and then what is the purpose for each of those? And then the techniques that you're going to be using. Also keeping in mind the performance characteristics that you're going to be verifying or validating, and the acceptance criteria for those performance characteristics, and then the overall goals in the end. What you will find, though, for any validation or verification is the methodology section, which really gives a detailed description of your materials and your methods that will be used. Will take the bulk of your time in going through how to set this up. And one of the first steps in the methodology is outlining the performance characteristics that you will be either evaluating or establishing for whether it be a verification or a validation, and then coming up with your acceptance criteria. What are those criteria that will say that that performance characteristic is meeting your specified requirements? You'll also spend quite a bit of time thinking about your samples, the sample size, that is, how many replicates do you need to do, and how you're going to prepare those samples. Some of the other things that you'll have to consider when you get into the methodology, again, are the reference materials or standards that you're going to be using, the types of controls and the reagents that you'll be needing to use, the instruments that go with that to ensure that the instruments are verified and working according to specifications, and then any software, statistical analysis, calculations, environmental conditions that need to be controlled, and the sequence of testing, and then how you're going to go about setting up the execution of that testing in the experimental design. So let's take a look at a few of these things in methodology. One of the primary things to start with are detailing the performance parameters or the performance characteristics. Those are interchangeable. It's really the meat and potatoes of any validation or the verification. For verification, you get this from the published method. So you'll do that literature review, you'll pull out the method that you want to adopt or bring into your laboratory, which is that standard method. And within that description of that published method, it's already going to state the performance characteristics. It's going to say you should get this linearity, you should have this level of precision or accuracy, you might encounter, this limit of detection or this limit of quant, and those are your performance characteristics that you'll be trying to achieve with your verification. For a validation, you're establishing those performance characteristics. And so it's going to take some time for you to describe what those performance characteristics or parameters are for that method validation. It really is based on the scope and the type of validation that you're doing, whether it be for identification, for screening, quantitative or qualitative purposes. And there really is no requirement in 17025 that dictates which performance characteristics must be addressed. However, 17025 7.2.2.3 says the performance characteristics of validated methods as assessed for the intended use shall be relevant to the customer's needs and consistent with specified requirements. So what are your specified requirements? What do you require regarding linearity? What do you require regarding specificity or selectivity or robustness? What do you require regarding bias or accuracy in that measurement? In the note of 7.2.2.3, it lists some of the performance characteristics that could be included with that validation or could be included with what it is that you're trying to verify. You could be looking at the measurement range, the accuracy, the uncertainty, the limits of detection or quantification, selectivity of the method, linearity, reproducibility, repeatability, or robustness, as well as cross-sensitivity or bias. So let's take a look at a few of these performance characteristics. Accuracy is defined by both precision and bias, and it is the closeness of agreement between the test result and the expected reference value, or what we call the known true value. And of course, we have conventional true values since we don't know the actual true value. Bias is the systematic error in a measurement. It's the tendency for the average of repeated measures to consistently deviate from that true value or that conventional value. And bias can be expressed as the difference between the mean value and the reference value. Precision, on the other hand, is the closeness of agreement between a series of repeated tests or measurements of the same sample under pre-described conditions and parameters. Precision can be statistically expressed as the variance or the standard deviation or coefficient of variation. And I'm sure most of you have seen the target example of precision and bias that describes accuracy. We're trying to get to the center of the target where we have no bias and very low variance or good precision, and that's depicted in the upper left-hand quadrant target, where our quantity values are closely clustered and centered around that target. We have bias, however, when those quantity values consistently are measured in the same fashion. So you can see bias in the target that's in the upper right-hand quadrant, where the cluster of quantity values are still pretty tight, so we still have low variance or good precision, but they're consistently up and to the right of our target, and that is showing bias. In the lower left-hand target, we again don't have bias, but we have really high variance. Here, the precision is not very good in that lower left-hand quadrant, where those quantity values or red dots are spread out, are more dispersed. And then, of course, the worst case scenario is the lower left-hand or lower right-hand target, where we have high variance as well as bias in our measurements. So again, accuracy really is described by looking at both precision and bias. We can look at precision, and we can estimate precision through repeatability studies or reproducibility studies. This is where we do multiple measurements over a period of time. So it's a condition of a test out of a set of conditions that includes the same procedure, same operator, same measuring system, same operating conditions, same location, and we're doing those replicate tests on the same or similar objects over a short period of time for repeatability. Reproducibility is similar. We still do replicate measurements over a longer period of time, but in this case, it could include different locations, operators, measuring systems on the same or similar objects. Both repeatability and reproducibility are measures of precision. Robustness as a performance characteristic is the evaluation of a method to remain unaffected by small variations in the method parameters. So after you've done some of your repeatability or reproducibility studies, maybe you've already determined a linear range or your limits of quant, then you can start adjusting some of the things within your procedure or your method, such as the pH, the temperature, the time that is allowed, the concentration of the reagent, maybe the volume that you're using or the brand of the reagent, and looking to see, does it maintain the parameter that we've already described? So it measures the reliability under your normal operating conditions in your laboratory. Provides an indication of the procedure's reliability during your normal usage. And typically it's determined during that method development. For verification, you may need to look at robustness because your laboratory conditions are going to be slightly different than everybody else's laboratory conditions. So look to see how robust is that standard method, even when you're bringing it into your laboratory under your normal operating conditions. Linearity and range kind of go hand in hand. Linearity is looking at the range of values that are directly proportional to the concentration of a target substance or value, and looking to see where you have that maximum linearity from limits of detection to saturation of the method. So it's really looking at a correlation coefficient of that linear regression and seeing that linear range, and then making sure that you work within that linear range from low limits to upper limits. So really that range is the interval between the upper and lower quantitation limit of the substance or analyte with a suitable level of precision and accuracy and linearity. Limits of quant and limits of detection, of course, go hand in hand for quantitative measures, needing to know your limits of detection so you can set background or that appropriate signal to noise ratio. And then limits of quant give you that lowest limit or even your upper limit of quant within that linear range. So it's the lowest and highest concentrations of a substance or an analyte in a sample that can be quantitatively determined with acceptable accuracy and precision. And then, of course, limits of detection, sometimes called sensitivity, or how low you can go and still detect that analyte or substance, allows you to set that background. Selectivity, on the other hand, is the extent to which other components which may be expected to be present interfere with the identification or quantification of the target substance or analyte. So we need to see about selectivity, even in some cases for our qualitative test as well as our quantitative test. So if you're doing, just for identification purposes, maybe a color test, if it's not selective for the analyte, as shown in the upper right-hand corner, where these might be normal cutting agents that might be with that analyte that you're trying to detect. You can see in this example, we have sugar, salt, flour, calcium carbonate. In these cases, if that analyte is in all of these, it's only detected as a native analyte. So all of these other things are interfering with the identification of that analyte. So in this case, it is not selective with these interfering substances, or it has those matrix effects. In the bottom, it's showing that yes, the test that we're using to detect that analyte is very selective, regardless of what else happens to be in that solution. So that's selectivity. Specificity is really a type of selectivity, and this is the ability to discriminate the target substance or analyte of interest from other components that may be chemically or structurally similar. So do you have cross-reactivity? And one example that I have here is a hemoglobin test that is not specific for human hemoglobin. It will also detect primate hemoglobin or ferret hemoglobin, so it's not specific. In the bottom, however, it's showing a hemoglobin test that is specific for human hemoglobin. And so that's a type, again, of selectivity, looking at the specificity or cross-reactivity. So that's some synopsis of some of the performance characteristics. There are additional performance characteristics that I didn't go over here, but for verification or validation, you're going to need to look at those performance characteristics that are either described in the standard method that you're going to be adopting, or look at those performance characteristics that you're trying to establish for that method that you will be validating. And these performance characteristics vary depending on the scope of the validation. You can have a screening method, a qualitative method, or a quantitative method. And for the screening or identification method, maybe very few performance characteristics need to be evaluated. But when you get to that quantitative method, there's going to be quite a few more performance characteristics that are going to need to be evaluated. Again, to the extent necessary is the language that's used in 17025, and you get to determine to the extent necessary for your specific requirements in your laboratory. There are some published performance characteristics guidelines that are out there. Here's an example of one of those publications. This is from the International Conference on Harmonization, where they will lay out, for those drug tests that you're doing for the identification of the drug, look at specificity. You must do that. For testing for impurities, if you're going to be doing quantitation or doing limits, here are the performance characteristics that need to be considered. Certainly, you can consider additional performance characteristics to meet your needs. So there's a question in the chat pod. It says, do I need to do a verification after every equipment maintenance? For example, a pipette was sent out for maintenance calibration. Do we need a verification when the pipette was returned and before putting back into service? So I don't think that there is a requirement that says that must be done, but you do need to consider in 17025, and I'll have to go back to that requirement. I think it is 6.4.4. That does say that you need to make sure, and I'm trying to pull out my 17025 for you. It says the laboratory shall verify that equipment conforms to specified requirements before being placed or returned into service. So in that case, think about how that pipette is being used. Certainly, I don't think the intent was when you're sending it out for calibration that you need to verify that. But I can tell you from experience, I have had pipettes come back and not meet my specifications after calibrations. So it's not a bad thing to do. But you do need to make sure it's meeting your requirements before you return it into service. So after you establish your performance characteristics, the other thing that you need to do with those performance characteristics is establish the acceptance criteria. So you may have performance characteristics where you're needing to determine the limits of detection, but what is the acceptance criteria? That is, how low do you need to go? What are your specified requirements for that range or that limit of detection? And that's what it means by put into place those acceptance criteria. They're really based on the intended use, whether it be a screening, qualitative or quantitative test. It's based on the customer's needs. It's based on the established acceptance criteria that have been published for that method if you're doing that verification of that performance parameter. And it's based on your specified requirements for that method that you have established in your methods for it being fit for use. I would say a lot of your time is going to be spent thinking about the performance characteristics and the acceptance criteria when you're doing method validation. Again, for verification of a method, these should already be expressed in the published literature. You also need to take some time in putting together your experimental design. That is, how are you going to set up the test to evaluate the performance characteristics and the acceptance criteria? How many samples are you going to use? What type of samples are you going to use? How are they going to be prepared? What reagents are you going to use? What controls are you going to use in addition to those samples? The equipment that's going to be part of this, and has the equipment already been verified? What parameters do the equipment need to be set at? And then what other materials or supplies will be needed? Also, don't forget to think about the calculations that you're going to be performing and any statistics in the software that you're going to be using. And then, of course, any of those required environmental conditions that need to be controlled, and then how you're going to sequence your performance characteristics. What are you going to do first? And if you go back to some of the published performance characteristics, they actually give you the sequence on what to do first. And typically it starts with looking at that linear range and maybe doing those repeatability, reproducibility studies. So think about how the tests are going to be performed. Do you have specific step-by-step instructions for how to perform the test? And then how is the associated data going to be collected and analyzed and the results interpreted and presented? Once you have the bulk of the methodology and the experimental design listed in your methodology, then you need to perform the experiments. And to me, this is the fun part of doing validation or even a verification, is actually doing the experiment and collecting the data and then analyzing that data. And that's what goes into performing the experiments. Keeping in mind that before you get to this step, you should have some way of how you're going to collect that data, how you want it organized, how you want it posted, so then you can take that information and analyze it and evaluate the results against the acceptance criteria. So you might need to go back and adjust that plan and do some retesting once you start evaluating that data to see that it's meeting your acceptance criteria. You may need to determine if additional performance characteristics need to be evaluated, determine if it's a go or no-go decision. And this is part of that risk-based thinking when you go into doing that verification or validation. And then thinking about how you're going to report all this information and what are the limitations to that reporting. So when you go in to perform the experiments and analyze the results, think about the results and are they meeting your acceptance criteria as you have them established? Do you need to adjust that plan, whether it be verification or validation? Do you need to perform any additional tests or do some retests? Do you need to go back and think about more environmental conditions that might need to be controlled? Think about the additional performance characteristics that might be evaluated, and if you're ready to make a decision to move on and accept the method as it is. Is it fit for purpose? List and describe those aspects or properties of the method validation that must be addressed for proper use and interpretation of the results. And don't forget about that interpretation of the results, because we need consistency in that interpretation as well. What are the key weaknesses of the method? What are the specific conditions that are required for performing that method? And where is the greatest degree of variability? And then what is the impact? What's that impact going to be overall? Think about reporting those results. What are the limitations of reporting the results or stating an opinion and interpretation? Is it to be used only for presumptive testing? Is a positive result not specific for the analyte? Is there some cross-reactivity that considered? Must you qualify the reported result with a statistic or with a qualitative statement? Must you perform a confirmatory test if you're going to report the result? And must you have this or that to state that opinion? So what must be present for that reporting? The last part of the validation plan and some things to consider is basically wrapping it all up and coming to your conclusions. That we've made a decision that it's fit for purpose and it's good to go. You need to write that validation report, keeping in mind that that validation report is different than the method that's to be implemented. So the validation report is just a summary of the validation and the results of that validation. You still have to develop the method that's going to be implemented in the laboratory for everyone to use. And then, of course, you follow your own review and approval process through your own document control in your laboratory, one for the review and approval of the validation, and two for the review and the approval of the method that needs to be implemented or that will be implemented. So that is all that I have for you for this brief introduction into what is a validation versus a verification and when to use them and some of the components of a validation plan. Certainly, if you want additional information on verification or validation, we have a new training module that is available, and the next course is going to be May 26th and 27th. We do this live online through WebEx, and that will be, of course, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. for those 2 days Eastern Time. I do see that there are a few questions. It says, will presentation slides be available for attendees? This webinar is being recorded, and yes, this recording will be available for you to view again. If there are any additional questions, please don't hesitate to type those into the chat pod.
Thank you, Emma. Would you mind passing me over the controls so I can provide with our attendees with some additional information? And I do see a number of questions that have come in both chat and Q&A. If you have your questions in a chat, would you please type them into Q&A? If you're having a hard time finding Q&A, I will go through I will try my best to go through the questions in a chat, but it's just a little more difficult. And I'll move on to Q&A once first. While you guys typing your questions over, I just wanted to give you a little more information on what is available from ANAB. We have a number of additional resources. Webcasts are free and pre-recorded videos providing additional information on accreditation and standards requirements. Of course, webinars, live informational sessions that are offered monthly. ANAB's blog has a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standard requirements, and many other topics. And of course, we offer many training courses that are currently all live online, but we do plan to return face-to-face training sometime in the middle of this year. We have in-person as well as self-paced training in many areas, and of course, those include internal auditing, standard requirements, measurement confidence, and risk analysis. This slide contains contact information if you're looking for whether accreditation or training or general information on ANAB. You can contact us at any of the email addresses currently displayed on your screens. Now, without undue delay, I will get back to our question period with questions. Give me one sec. They are coming in, so I will try. Emma, question number one. How do performance checks and or software checks fit into the validation verification language?
Yeah, so performance checks, like on equipment that you set up, you still get to decide when the performance check or that intermediate check is necessary. And certainly doing an intermediate check or that performance check on the equipment, maybe you're going to do it once a month or on a scalar balance to check that it's still within calibration status. You're performing a verification that it's still working according to your specifications. So that's a type of verification that you're doing on that piece of equipment as a performance check or an intermediate check. You get to decide when that's necessary.
Next question is, what is considered a standard method?
Yes, I think I touched on that a little bit earlier on a standard method. 17020 actually does a better job than 17025 in describing what is a standard method. But we have three types of methods that are typically described: standard methods, non-standard methods, laboratory developed methods. A standard method is a method that has already been validated and has already been published. Some of those published standard methods are published and pushed up to like the American National Standards Institute website. And you can go to the ANSI website and you can see a list of standard published methods. That is, they've been validated, they've been adopted in the scientific community as a method that is good, that is a good method to use and to implement. So the performance characteristics have already been established regarding linearity, limits of detection, limits of quant, specificity, selectivity. Standard methods can be published on the ANSI website. It could be an international published method, regional, national, published in a scientific journal, which is typically that peer-reviewed journal. So those are all considered standard methods, or even a method from a manufacturer on how to use their piece of equipment. Non-standard methods are all those other things. Could be a non-standard method that was developed in another laboratory, but yet they haven't published that method, but you want to adopt that in your laboratory. Non-standard method.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. We have a lot of questions coming in. Do I need to do a verification after every equipment maintenance? For example, a pipette was sent out for maintenance calibration. Do we need a verification when the pipette was returned and before putting back into service?
And this goes back to that 644 requirement that I read earlier that says the laboratory shall verify that equipment conforms to specified requirement before being placed or returned into service. And so there's some indication that yes, when you pull a piece of equipment out for service or maintenance, that you need to verify it. So the intent here is when you're pulling it out for service or maintenance, and there's been the discussion that if I'm sending it out for calibration, that's not necessarily maintenance on that piece of equipment or not servicing that piece of equipment. So you get to decide on when you're returning it into service if it's meeting your specified requirements and perform that verification.
Thank you. Next question. When verifying a published method, does the lab need to specify the acceptance criteria around the published criteria? Or is it okay to see how the method performs and then decide if the performance is acceptable?
Yeah, it's sort of a circular argument. I can see where it possibly could be done either way. But this is where there might be some bias that comes in to it. Certainly, we typically start with a published method and the performance criteria and the acceptance criteria that have been published. And that usually is the basis for where we start those acceptance criteria. Now, for you in your laboratory, you're right, you might have acceptance criteria that are stronger than or not as high, and that's okay too. But in your plan, you need to state that, you know, we're going to start with these performance characteristics and these acceptance criteria and make a determination if that's okay for us. And you could certainly move those acceptance criteria based on your specified requirements.
Okay, next question. If an instrument that goes out of service will require a verification, correct? If so, does this require a quality incident to be started?
Could you repeat the first part of that?
Yeah, give me a second. If an instrument that goes out of service will require a verification, okay, I apologize. Let me rephrase it. If an instrument goes out of service, it will require a verification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the second part, would this require a quality incident to be started? I assume it means to be documented or
Right.
to open up an incident, quality incident report.
Right. It depends on why it was pulled out for maintenance or service. Certainly, we pull instruments out of service all the time to do routine maintenance. That is part of the regularly scheduled maintenance schedule. Certainly, you need to verify once you do that maintenance to put it back into service. Now, you might pull a piece of equipment out of service because you had non-conforming work. And if it is non-conforming work, that is things didn't work as expected and your controls didn't work or something happened, then yes, you follow the non-conforming work criteria that are outlined in, I think it's 710. Non-conforming work is 7.10. When you follow the non-conforming work criteria laid out in 7.10, you make a decision whether or not you can just correct it and move on, or whether you need to move that over into corrective action. So however your system is set up for that. But it all depends on why you took it out of service to begin with.
Okay, next one. Should method development be done before validation? Then the validation should validate the method?
Yeah, again, another circular kind of question. You're right, method development is part of that validation. And some of the method development that you're referring to could be done when you're talking about setting up the materials and methods and how you're going to go about selecting the samples and looking at those performance criteria. So you're actually doing that method development for that and setting it up and then doing the validation. It's kind of circular and not really teased out very well in 17025 either, because it says for non-standard methods, laboratory developed methods, or standard methods used outside of their intended scope. So it really doesn't specifically talk about method development other than having laboratory developed methods.
Okay. Next question. If a major part of an instrument has been replaced and we need to develop a new acceptance criteria for the performance check, is this considered as a verification or validation?
I think if you're having to establish a new performance characteristic and the acceptance criteria for that, it would be a validation. But keep in mind, a validation is a type of verification and it needs to be as extensive as is necessary to meet your specified requirements. So really it gets to semantics sometimes. You already have a validated method that you're using, but you're modifying that method. So then the validation as extensive as is necessary.
Is equipment verification required after annual PMs?
And I'm assuming PM is performance maintenance. So this is similar to some other questions that have been addressed when you pull equipment out of service. It doesn't specify in 17025 what it means when you return it to service, if that's doing your annual performance maintenance. But you get to decide because you have to verify that it's working according to your specifications. Now, you might do your normal performance maintenance, but before somebody uses that piece of equipment after that performance maintenance, they might run their controls. So they're verifying that it's working according to those specifications. It's all part of your performance maintenance plan on how you want to verify that that piece of equipment is still working according to specifications.
Thank you. And I know we're at 3 o'clock. I'm going to cut off question period and just ask 3 more questions that I have. Next one, if the procedure is all the same, but the same type changes, example, originally solid, want to add liquid, would that require a validation or just be verification?
If your performance characteristics are already established and your acceptance criteria are already established and you're going from one type of medium to another, it's probably going to be a verification. But again, this is where those words are semantic. Because a validation is a verification, and whether you validate or verify, it just needs to be as extensive as necessary for you to be comfortable and confident that it's meeting your specified requirements. So yeah, changing the medium could be a verification if you're using that same method to do that.
Okay, next question. Our digital evidence unit has a version release updates very frequently. Can a verification be done on these versus validation to make sure they're fit for the intended use? These are usually minor changes. Our examiners review the release notes and functionality, and I give them a Qualtrics test to verify this is done.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're doing is perfectly okay to do that. I get it with digital evidence or with those software version updates. They are done very frequently. Verification that it's still meeting your needs and that it's fit for use. Yeah.
Emma, I'm going to ask that question, but I'm not sure if we can provide the answer, so I'll let you decide on that. I live in Maryland where COMAR, C-O-M-A-R, I assume that's an acronym, has additional terms of internal validation and development validation. Can you help explain the similarities, differences of these based on ANAB's definitions?
So the definitions that I'm using are from 17025 and they're ISO definitions, not ANAB definitions. And I'm not sure what COMAR stands for, but I know that DNA has additional definitions for internal validation and developmental validations. For me, I liken developmental validations to laboratory developed methods. You're developing a method for use inside your laboratory. And that could be an internal validation as well. That is, you do that validation within your laboratory. As opposed to external validations is where that method has been validated by some other source outside of your laboratory. And there are companies out there that do this. There are universities that do this. Marshall University will do validation studies for you. And that's an external validation. You still have to bring that method into your laboratory and verify that it works if they publish that validation. So that's how I liken those. But really, the definitions I used are from ISO.
Thank you so much. That concludes our session for today. Emma, thank you so much for your time, and everyone online, thank you so much for joining us today. Please keep an eye on upcoming webinars, and we'd love to see you again. On a separate note, I have stopped the recording right now. I do see a couple of questions related to accreditation requirements, specifically for your laboratories. Please direct those to your accreditation managers here at ANAB, and they would be in the best position to answer them. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon, evening.